thank you for coming out tonight. This is the first time in a long time I've been in Seattle. Actually, Becky and I have been in Canada on a vacation on the train, and when I got called by Karen, who found out I was going to Canada, she asked me if I would be willing to stop in Seattle on our way back. So this is where I am at this moment. So this is Veterans Day. I guess it's appropriate to talk about what Veterans Day means, at least to me, and I suspect to a number of the veterans who are here tonight. I'm 62, so I've been through this 62 times. It was actually called Armistice Day in my early days. The day that was supposed to commemorate the end of World War I, the war to end all wars, and here we are 85 years later, many wars later. So we're addicted to war. And there's a book outside called Addicted to War, Why the U.S. Can't Lick Militarism. It's an excellent comic book history of the United States and why we are addicted to war. And my journey has been a long and difficult one, like it has been for so many people, veterans and non-veterans alike, to come to understand the make-believe version of history that we were taught about the United States civilization. A fantasy, if you will. It took me a long time to grasp just how big the lie really has been. A deep lie. A lie that is perpetuated, in my opinion, every time we pledge allegiance to the flag, the most violent symbol on the planet, in my opinion. Now, I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. Conservative parents in a conservative farming town in a Baptist church where my parents were still talking in the 50s about the problems with the New Deal and with labor unions. This was still their concern in the 50s when I was a small child. They also didn't like people of various colors and nationalities other than Northern European. But this was a typical value in my town. I didn't know anything different. I was a jock. My life was athletics. Ideology meant virtually nothing to me. By the way, can everybody hear me okay? No. Well, I need to get this up then. It's up as far as it'll go. Is that better? All right. As I said, my life for the first really 22 or 3 years of my life after the age of 8 or 9 was dominated by sports. So ideology meant virtually nothing to me. I was living and had been born in the greatest country in the history of the world, endowed by God to bring justice to the whole planet. It was a wonderful story. I felt proud to have been so fortunate to have been born and raised in such a fairy tale, if you will, society. And it is a wonderful feeling to experience this connection to an ideology and a country that was so noble. And one of the problems that we have, in my opinion, in this society is that our sense of security and our sense of feeling okay is very much associated with this mythology of America, the culture that is extraordinarily noble and extraordinarily just, when in fact it has been virtually the opposite, in my opinion. But I am speaking here because I have my opinions. So I will not keep saying my opinion. So I was sailing through my early years. I went to college, out of high school, and I went to graduate school before I was in the military. I was drafted at 25 out of law school with a 2S deferment. That was a school deferment in those days, and I didn't know that you could be drafted with a school deferment. But I discovered there were some exceptions, and I fit in the exceptions. I was very much for the war in Vietnam. I was very much for the war against global communism. I was very much in favor of the United States being the leader in that fight against global communism. But I was not a person that really wanted to go to war myself. So I was very happy that others were eagerly signing up, but apparently not enough because, as you know, they were drafting a lot of people. And I thought I was protected with a school deferment. But when I was drafted at 25 years of age, I had no political or philosophical reason to oppose my draft. So instead of going into the Army, I enlisted in an Air Force officer program, thinking that I was going to have at least a reasonably mild term in the military. And in fact, the first 2 years, I was, for some reason, assigned to Headquarters Air Force in Washington on the Inspector General's staff as a second lieutenant. A really plush white-collar assignment. However, the forces of maybe the Great Spirit, but certainly of the United States, had other plans. I was selected to be in a special classified Air Force mission that sent me to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for 12 weeks of Ranger training with 40 men under my command to learn how to play war games. I was kind of startled at this assignment. I didn't know why the Air Force was involved in things that I thought the Army and the Marines should be conducting. But my unit and 8 other units similar to mine were all trained at Fort Campbell by the Army to go to Vietnam in special missions to protect air bases, either on the base or in close proximity to the base. And it really wasn't anything like being in the Army and the Marines, but it was, at least as I anticipated it, something that I was not looking forward to. 6 weeks into the training, my first clue that something else was brewing in me occurred when, during bayonet training, after affixing my bayonet and being told with 20 other officers in this particular training to plunge the bayonet into the dummy 100 times and shout "kill" as loud as I could, that I paused a moment, trying to get myself fired up to plunge the bayonet and scream "kill" over and over again. The other officers were already started. I was still, for some reason, finding this a little bit difficult. I paused long enough that the sergeant who was training us ordered or asked me in a loud voice, in a screaming voice in my ear, "Did you hear that order?" And I said, "Yes, sir." For purposes of the training, we had no rank on, and the sergeant was our boss. And I fully expected that I would carry out the bayonet training, but lo and behold, I paused for another few seconds, trying to get myself somehow overcoming my resistance, and the sergeant kicked me in the calf, and my legs buckled. I went to my knees, and at that point I said, "I'm not doing this exercise." And I never did the bayonet training. It wasn't my intention, but it's how it turned out. But it was a clue. There was something else, I think, percolating in me that was trying to emerge. It didn't interfere with my being sent to Vietnam with my unit. And on March 8, 1969, we landed at Binh Tui Air Base in the Mekong Delta, about 100 miles south of Saigon. And the moment we landed, at night, we'd flown down from Phan Rang, further north in the country, and the pilot was shouting at us to get off the plane because he said he saw flashes in the distance and he knew we were going to be hit soon. And sure enough, in about 10 seconds, the explosion started. And we were scrambling off the back of that, whatever it was, a C-123 or C-130, and we were greeted by somebody with a flashlight with a red cover telling us to follow him to the bunker. And when we got in the bunker, there was one of my airmen on my left grabbed my arm and told me he was scared. And I said, "Oh shit, I'm scared too. What else would you expect? This is our baptism." And unpredictably as it turned out, I was asked by the Vietnamese base commander, Colonel An, after I was there 3 weeks, he wanted me to go with one of his lieutenants to inspect targets after South Vietnamese bombing missions. He had rumors that the pilots were deliberately missing their targets. I hadn't really thought about what a target was. The first time I went, which was in April of '69, in my Jeep, the target turned out to be a village, a little village south of Sadek that had been bombed 15 minutes earlier, and all I saw were somewhere between 120 and 130 corpses. Some water buffalo lying on the ground, and a lot of smoke. And I was shocked that this must have been a mistake of intelligence, that this target was a village. So, although I was aghast at what I had saw, and I won't go into the details tonight because I don't feel like I can talk about the details at this moment, I did throw up, and I was crying, and my Vietnamese lieutenant sidekick asked me what my problem was. And without thinking, I responded with something like, "I'm looking at my family." I have no idea where that came from. I had not grown up in a family that had philosophical or even religious discussions. Certainly there was no record of dissent in my family. But something had really exploded inside of me. And at that point, I kind of sensed that I was the invader, which of course I was, but I didn't really fully understand that at that moment. And these people were in their village. My village was 10,000 miles further east in New England. And when we got back to the base, I wrote up a report about that bombing, and I had to do this 5 more times in the next 12 days, 10 or 12 days. And in each case, of course, I saw the same thing. Somewhere between 700 and 900 bodies in 12 or 13 days that I witnessed. Nobody was on their feet in these villages. There were a few people that were still moving, just barely. And do you think that we even called in any kind of medical support? No, we just left. It was a victory. Victory over communism. At that point, I realized that something was really amiss in the way I had grown up, in the history I had learned, in the values I had learned, in the capacity to think or not think. Remember, at this time I was 27, I already had a master's degree, and I was halfway through law school, and I had been valedictorian earlier in my life. Wow. Gotten all this far in my life, sailing along, hadn't even asked one question about being ordered to go halfway around the world to participate in killing people I knew nothing about. So that's how heavy the brainwashing is. That's how heavy the make-believe story about America is. America, the United States of America. Well, soon after that, I went into a command bunker and I started pulling the pins off the maps. The maps were targets for future bombings. I knew that those pins meant more civilians being killed. By the way, in these villages, the bombings were in the middle of the day, probably at 200 feet. No anti-aircraft guns, no AK-47s. These were fishing villages and rice farming villages in the Delta. As I pulled those pins off, I said to the major in there, I said, under the rules of engagement, which I had to learn, 2 days worth of study in officer training school, you cannot kill civilians or destroy civilian infrastructure targets. He just grabbed my shirt and threw me out of the command bunker. He was 6'5", I was 6'3". He was a major, I was a first lieutenant. And I was shaking. I thought, they don't even care about the law. That's how naive I was. I thought there were rules of engagement. I thought we were civilized people. So, I've been on a different journey since then. It's pretty irreversible, this kind of knowledge. It's pretty profound. It begins motivating one to search a different perspective from history. When I came back to the States, I actually was sent home early, as you might imagine, because I was really protesting these bombings. I thought they were illegal, which they were. And I realized I was on the wrong side. If there were sides, I really shouldn't have been on the side I was on. And one of the things that bothered me the most in my first thoughts were, geez, I'm no longer going to be one of the guys. You know, I'd always been such a happy guy with the other jocks and just kind of sailing through life. And in those days, in the 60s, before the late 60s, getting a college degree and a graduate education was a ticket to material success and accomplishing the American way of life. And that's what I wanted. That's what people had told me was what I should want. But I was so angry when I got back, as you can imagine, realizing that everybody was participating in a grand lie. My history teachers, my Sunday school teachers, my parents, the politicians, other national leaders. And every time since then, I see the flag. I'm sorry for those who might be offended, but the flag, to me, the U.S. flag, is a violent symbol, and I feel it very viscerally. It is something I cannot help. In the small city of Arcata, California, where I live, one of our 5 city council members does not stand up at the beginning of each council meeting and pledge allegiance to the flag. He sits. He stated that he swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, not to pledge allegiance to the flag. So for many years I've been searching an answer to the question, number one, what was it in me that said I was just looking at my family? I was always curious where that came from. And secondly, I wanted to know why we were so addicted to violence and war. It was a perplexing question for me, and it was brought home even more to me how affected I had been when I was admitted to the practice of law in Washington, D.C. in 1970, December 72, and I was a criminal lawyer, and in my first case, my first week, an indigent defendant in federal court in Washington, when the bailiff came in and said, "Everybody rise," and I didn't rise. It wasn't that I was thinking about it, it was that my body was reviling. I think like when I had to fix that bayonet and plunge it, there was something about this standing up automatically for this man coming in a black robe that kind of didn't feel right to me. It was like, I've been there, I've done that. And now I don't trust that. So the judge, seeing I was a rookie, called me up to the bench and said, "Son, you have to abide by the protocol of the court." And I said, "Yes, Your Honor." But it happened 2 more times in the next 2 weeks, each with a different judge, fortunately. And my wife at the time was a lawyer, and I never told her in the 11 years we were married why I left the law after 2 weeks. After all that training and all that study and all that tuition money. Wow, I thought I was pretty screwed up. Couldn't adapt to the basic rules of my profession. Wow, that's pretty incredible. Couldn't adapt. Isn't that what you have to do when you become an adult? You adapt. You do the rules in order to get by, to get along. Well, my body, my visceral in my body was so strong that I couldn't ignore it. I could feel the turbulence in my belly. Just like, what? So I left the law after 2 weeks. What am I going to do now? Well, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but it's been a long, fairly interesting journey from that point to here. That was 30 years ago. But in 1981, I was working for a state senator in Massachusetts as his legislative aide dealing with prison issues and veterans issues. And I was investigating brutality complaints at Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts. I was interviewing prisoners on cell block 10 one day when I witnessed 2 guards pulling a prisoner out of a cell at the other end of the cell block, stomping on him and hitting him with billy clubs. And totally out of the blue, to me, I was in a flashback in a village in Vietnam, walking over bodies in that first village. I remembered it vividly at that moment. I was reliving it. I thought I was there. But I was walking on a cell block runway, holding the bars. As I walked out, I rushed out of the prison because I knew something terrible was happening to me. And I got to my car, and I just shook for maybe an hour and a half and wept until I could kind of sense that I was not in Vietnam, that I was actually sitting in my car in this prison parking lot. I'm sure some of you have experienced flashbacks. I had never known anything about them. I thought I had escaped Vietnam. It was past tense. It had radicalized me, but I didn't feel emotionally tormented by it until then. Every day since June 19th, 1981, I think about Vietnam and I think about that village. Throughout the day, it just comes and goes. It makes you and keeps you honest. It means you won't forget what you learned. But in my search for why we're addicted to war, I think one has to come to some pretty ungluing conclusions. We're addicted to war because we're addicted to the American way of life. The American way of life is addicted to insatiable consumption. We have 4.5% of the world's population, but we consume anywhere from 1/4 to nearly half the world's resources, depending on the resource one examines. And the only way you can do that is through theft, at gunpoint. And then you look at how our civilization was founded. Like many other civilizations have been founded. They steal the land at gunpoint from people who are living on the land. They steal labor at gunpoint in order to acquire free or cheap labor. And then in the 20th century, some call the American century, we stole resources from more than 120 countries around the world, with 300 military interventions and thousands of covert interventions since the end of World War II, in order to have all the resources we want at very cheap prices. And remember, the American way of life is non-negotiable. We've been told that many times. It's not negotiable because the American people, meaning the people of the United States, demand their 100 kinds of toothpaste 24 hours a day, and demand their right to drive whatever they want to drive for however many miles they want to drive any time of the day or night. We don't have to think about consequences. We don't have to think about the web of life, which is what had come to me in that moment when I looked at those people on the ground and said, this is my family. My family. Wow. They were in their village. I was standing as an ideological robot looking at them, realizing I was no longer really the good guy. But I had been shamelessly duped. I was cannon fodder. And I really, for many years, was ashamed that I had never asked any questions about the war. Just asking a question in advance. So when we just were in Canada, I met several people in Vancouver Island who were U.S. men who went to Canada to avoid the military, and I hugged them. Said I had known any better when I was their age. And I wished I had known about those options. So I would have had some choices to make, to take some responsibility for whether I was going to uphold my conscience, which I didn't have one at the time that I was aware of, but I wished I had, or whether I was going to just say, okay, I have to go because that's the law. These people, to me, are heroes because they exercise their conscience. A conscience I didn't know about yet. So when we look at this structural injustice of 4.5% consuming this huge, disproportionate amount of world resources, we really have to start looking at ourselves. We have to begin a process that I call a revolution of consciousness, where we become world citizens, where we replace our loyalty to nation state, to our sense of awe of living on a planet that's been here for 4 billion years, in a universe that's been here 14 billion years, and our species has been evolving for 7 million years. We've been through many adaptations to get this far in our evolutionary history. And now there's a huge adaptation sitting right in front of us, or maybe it's already inside of us, awaiting explosion. It's a quantum leap in consciousness. It recognizes that we are all equally part of a sacred web of life. There's no way that a capitalist economic system or a quote-unquote democratic system like ours can survive with that consciousness, because it requires responsibility. It requires sharing. It requires a commitment to justice. And a commitment to justice and sharing requires a radical shift in the way we live our lives, both individually and collectively, not just in the United States, but in the Western world. Remember, the majority of the world, 75% of the population, increasingly are placed in impoverishment and misery because of the obsession of globalization to bring profits to ever fewer people, with most of us complicit in that process, which is the hard part, because we can continually talk about our corrupt political system and our absolutely immoral economic system, but that system thrives because there hasn't yet been sufficient uprising and dissent to stop it and to replace it with something different. And I do believe that the left in general lacks an alternative vision. We're good at analysis. After all, we live in a society that doesn't even acknowledge it has a class problem. I mean, we know we have a race problem, but we have a class problem. We have a society that was founded and has been sustained by white male Christians. It's really still a white male supremacy society. It's pretty astounding. We've made inroads here and there, and then they get beat back. But our addiction to war and our addiction to our way of life absolutely demands at this point in our history such a radical shift if we're going to survive as to be almost beyond comprehension, certainly to my family, who really love Bush. But then maybe Bush and his cabal is what I call a cosmic gift in disguise. Because we are in such deep denial, and we are in such really deeply addicted to a way of life that doesn't require understanding consequences. It's like the goddess of the cosmos has said, I'm going to give you one more chance to get it. If you don't get it now, you're out. It's so brazen. It's been so unmasked. The Democrats would never have been this brazen. They would never have unmasked imperialism like George Bush and his cabal. And so, perhaps 9/11, which should elicit a question why, and Bush's response to 9/11, which was, far worse than 9/11, of course, but so brazen that I'm hoping that it has set in process what couldn't have happened before 9/11 and Bush's response to 9/11. A deeply discerning question of what the hell's going on here. What on earth is happening? Maybe our culture really is so sick, so dumbed down, so glueless and clueless, that we really do have to begin understanding we're not going to be a commodity. We're not going to be deregulated out of existence. And we're not going to be privatized down to the lowest common denominator of just being a purchaser or consumer, as Colin Powell said 7 days after 9/11, now you can go shop again. It's pretty pathetic. And yet, the future rests in our hands, yours and mine. It rests in the capacity which we totally have as a species to make radical shifts when our survival is necessary and required. We know mathematically and ecologically we cannot survive. The earth can't sustain 6.3 billion people, certainly not at the rate we consume resources. The World Wildlife Federation this year did their footprint analysis, this accounting tool to determine how many footprints the earth can handle, human footprints. There's 11.4 billion hectares on the planet that's usable for land and water for human needs. We have 6.3 billion people, that leaves 1.8 hectares per person. The majority world, so-called third world, averages 1.4 hectares per person. 0.4 hectares below the earth, what is sustainable in the earth. The average for all the people on the earth is 2.3 hectares, already 25% above what is sustainable. Europeans average 5 hectares per person. The United States averages 9.6 hectares per person. We have to get back to at least 1.8. Well, and the only way that's going to happen is if we really want to live badly enough with dignity, with responsibility, that we will make the changes, because we will know that that's what's necessary for us to live with dignity and in peace, so that we no longer have to be addicted to war. Now, I happen to live in northern Humboldt County, where we talk a lot about bioregionalism and local food economies. And I've spent a lot of time studying the Zapatistas in Chiapas. I've gone down there 5 times and spent a lot of time in the villages with the Mayans. I've watched how the Mayans deal with the army coming through with U.S. equipment day after day after day. There's 1,000 autonomous communities in Chiapas in this, after the Zapatista uprising in 1994. They don't want globalization, and they have articulated a beautiful essay describing why globalization destroys the essence of humanity and why they want a local autonomous economy and culture preserved. They do not even want cash. They do not want to be employees. They want to preserve a local culture that's free of both state power and corporate power. And they're willing to die for it. They, I think, offer us a model, a real, live, vital model which we can learn from. We're not necessarily going to become Mayans or like Mayans, but they do have a vision of a way to sustain themselves with dignity that we could benefit from. And in Humboldt County, we talk about this bioregional model that maybe we need to begin modeling ourselves. A local food economy, drastically reducing transportation. In our case, in our house, we have now 2,500 watts of solar panels, and solar hot water, and permaculture gardens, which I spend increasing amounts of time on to keep my own life grounded. And now an electric truck, a 1984 Chevy S10 pickup truck that I removed the exhaust system, the cooling system, the gas tank, and the engine, and replaced it with an electric motor and 24 6-volt batteries, charging off my own solar panels. That's pretty cool. I have a range of 50 miles, and that kind of defines my range. I have a hand cycle, so I usually do 50 miles a week on my hand cycle, which I can do easily all my errands, go to the university, go to city hall meetings, go to the co-op, and go out to the ocean 3 miles away. So sometimes I say I'm trying to live a life as if I was in a Neolithic village 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, before the urban civilizations brought us the model of male domination, hierarchy, bureaucracy, enforced labor pools, and violence. And I add to that Neolithic model, which is about a 20-mile range for a local economy that was foot distance, what I call Buddhist economics, the right livelihood, and appropriate technology. It's my beginning outline of a vision of the alternative, which would fit into a bioregional model. We talk a lot, we joke a lot in Humboldt County about seceding from the Union. Seceding from the nation state. It's dragging us down. It's killing people in our name because we have demanded too much oil. We have demanded too much materialism ourselves. just the beginning process of re-examining how we live and what the consequences are. Because, as my Nicaraguan mother told me over and over again when I used to go to Esteli, Nicaragua, she said, "Brian, don't worry about your longevity. Really focus on your dignity, your dignity, your dignity. That requires you to be present every day with all that you have to do what you believe is right. Don't worry about how long you're going to live. Worry about the quality of your day." And that has stuck with me. And she told me that after several counterattacks had occurred just west of Esteli, where I was living at the time, and I watched 11 bodies come in on horse-drawn wagons. Open caskets, very slowly going to the cemetery. 5 children, 3 mothers, and 3 elderly gentlemen. And I was outraged, of course, and I found myself again weeping. My God, what are we doing? We go everywhere, and we have this obscene language of accusing people of being either Marxist-Leninists or terrorists or drug traffickers that so easily placates the American public into supporting bombing, maiming, terrorizing people. Imagine. It's incredible. I mean, I have not been able to explain hardly any of what I've witnessed in the world to my own family. They don't believe their son. They can't comprehend that the United States would do such things. It's done formally with plausible deniability, meaning lying, meaning creating false pretexts, which maybe under Bush, all the pretexts for the war have been so fraudulent and so transparent and even exposed by the mass media in the last few months. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it will provoke some historical shift in those of us that talk about living under the Western model, which I do believe is now about 6,000 years old. It really started with the urban civilizations, this model of male oligarchic structures enforced by bureaucracy and violence. We've had inroads throughout that 6,000 years, but the prevailing model always consumes these alternatives. And so maybe Mr. Bush is the end of this 6,000-year cycle. And maybe we are the people who will emerge to create an alternative that enables our species to survive in peace on the planet. Otherwise, we will not survive. And I actually get up each day and I'm excited about being alive. Maybe I've been near death too many times to really appreciate, wow, I'm still alive. That's incredible. And I look at the stars at night and see all that awesome display in the sky that's been there billions of years. And I just think, wow, we think we have all these economic and political agendas that we take so seriously. And here's this awesome universe. What on earth are we doing? Where is our humility? Where is our sense of self? Where is our sense of wanting to be part of this incredible world? Well, it's a pretty formidable task. But when you consider the stakes of not taking on the challenge, of understanding our consequences and really taking responsibility for our lives and beginning to walk what we consider a more sustainable path, what option do we have? I mean, suicide. I've had 12 veteran friends that have committed suicide. It's been pretty close. That has been brought home to me very closely. I understand the Pentagon admits that 13 Iraqi U.S. soldiers have committed suicide, and when there's another 23 that are suspected suicides. Maybe our whole Western way of life is a form of suicide. I don't know. At a deep psychic level. All I know is that I want to live, and I know lots of people that want to live, and we have the capacity, totally have the capacity to make shifts in the way we live and think. After all, I had an epiphany in April of 1969 where all of a sudden I saw dead Vietnamese as my family. Wow. I've never been the same since. Even though for a little while I kind of wanted to go back the way I was, but there was no way to do it. I couldn't go back. And now I feel thankful. So I think we are at an incredible moment in history. We are at a pivotal evolutionary moment in human history. And I don't know how it's going to shake out. We're clearly witnessing biological and cultural evolutionary collisions. And of course we'll lose in the collision. Maybe we'll have a side swipe. But it's clear that we do have options, and we have choices, and we have even an evolutionary memory about survival that has been submerged under ideological conditioning that makes us feel really important as nationalists or racists or sexists, whatever. But that can be overcome rather quickly when it's necessary to survive. You know, in war and other emergencies, you discover you have adrenaline. Your body, without thinking about it, makes moves to survive. When you perceive the danger in front of you, you actually don't think about what you're going to do. You move in one way or another, and you act. Because your evolutionary being wants to survive. And I want to survive with dignity. And the question is how we as a people are going to take that challenge. We have to understand this is a long history. Our civilization, what I call the make-believe society, the fantasy from George Washington chopping down the cherry tree to the latest war in Iraq. It's maintained by lies and a mythology that is rotely continued day after day after day, and if you stand up against it, you're of course ostracized. If you don't pledge allegiance to the flag when you're with a group, you're ostracized. But it makes people think, I'm no longer going to be a robot. I'm questioning now, and I'm going to walk my path, and whatever happens, happens. But at least I can feel good about my path and my walk. With or without artificial legs. So actually I'm kind of excited about what I'm feeling around the world at this moment. The majority of the people in the world, of course, don't believe in our system. It doesn't benefit them. And the ironical thing is most of us don't benefit from it either. Pretty ironic. My blue-collar family back home doesn't benefit from it. But they sit and watch television and support George Bush. It's easy. Feels good. They don't have to think. They think I'm just a really just a screw-up. They don't understand me. The one member of all this extended family that was really good in school, good in sports, good in church, honor society, college graduate, military officer, they were just so happy to watch their cousin and their nephew proceeding through this American way of life until I came back in 1969 and said, it's all a lie. It's all a lie, and I have to live with the fact that I witnessed 700 or 800 or 900 people that didn't deserve to die for this lie. And I wish they'd seen those bodies. And maybe they would have discovered their soul. And maybe they would have walked a different path. And we would be able to have family picnics once again. I haven't been back in so long, I can't even remember the last time I was there. It's too painful for me. I can't handle it, I admit. It's easier with strangers than with my family. It's not so emotionally loaded. To remind you a little bit of our history from the words of one of our most famous veterans, Smedley Butler, the most highly decorated general in Marine history. If I can find the quote, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this and heard this quote. I had it marked, but I lost my mark. Anyway, he talks about how he was a muscle man for big business, 33 years in the Marine Corps. He was a muscle man for big business, and he identifies all the businesses that he was protecting in Haiti and Cuba and Mexico and China, and it's a pretty incredible statement from one of our veterans. And he said this after, of course, he was out of the Marine Corps in the 1930s. He was a muscle man for big business. And as you rightly know, Noam Chomsky said there's a fifth freedom. The first four freedoms that Roosevelt talked about, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, that those were the four freedoms that America supported and represented and protected. Chomsky said no. Those are not the freedoms that the United States protects. The fifth freedom is what they protect. The freedom to exploit, pillage, and rob around the world. Because we have to maintain our way of life. And Smedley Butler understood it, as many of you understand it. And now we have to take that information and that awareness and that knowledge and build a foundation for a new way, a new life. Even if we have to take steps that are hard, even if we have to make statements that seem outrageous at times. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk, has called Vietnam veterans the tip of the lighted candle in this culture. Vietnam is where the omnipotent sense of America was punctured. It was pierced in such a way that you could even argue that what we're doing today is a result of that puncturing. The bully that was cut down by people 5 feet tall, these slope-head, slant-eyed bastards that we call vermin. We could apologize, as we've never apologized, of course, but we are now going to prove that we are so superior nobody will ever challenge us again. We will develop the technology to kill, and we will do it in such a way we don't have to incur many casualties, which was what we, of course, learned from the Vietnam War. And from now on, when we intervene, you have to do it without casualties. Maybe we've gotten to a quagmire here in Iraq that's even shocking our cabal. I don't know. Few casualties too many maybe right now. Never thinking about the Iraqis. But maybe this is the moment. And if you study Jungian psychology and the shadow concept, and chaos theory and know about quantum leaps and the butterfly effect, things can happen real fast, real suddenly. And maybe something is percolating in this country. Maybe there's a early earthquake in the making. And when that earthquake gets a little further along on a seismic scale, there all of a sudden becomes the 100th monkey concept, where all kinds of people begin realizing we have been sold a bill of goods and it's going to destroy us. And then we perceive the danger, and when you perceive the danger, you move quickly. You shift gears fast. And you share your process and your awareness with your neighbors because it's exciting. So this is my hope, that we will rediscover imagination. And we will understand that we, with our hope and with our solidarity with people all over the world, we will change this country. Maybe we will even devolve into bioregions. Yay, yay. And no longer have to pledge allegiance to this flag that is the most violent symbol on the planet, that keeps us, and I think keeps us from taking this plunge out of the make-believe, out of the fantasy, and start taking responsibility and really, really feeling the excitement of empowering ourselves to walk a different path. Thank you very much.